over to our presenter this evening. Christy, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm Christy Shane Hendricks. I'm the rector of Ascension and Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in Pueblo, Colorado, which is about an hour and 45 minutes south of Denver, along the I-25 corridor, we call it. I'm really delighted to be with you tonight. Just a little bit about myself. My background is obviously as a priest, but also I have been trained as a mediator, or one might say a facilitator in conflict resolution, reconciliation, or transformation through the Lombard Mennonite Justice Center, Peace Center in Chicago. I've also engaged in their 2-year clergy clinic in family systems, which deals with a lot of not only using oneself, but many ways to address and be present to folks in the midst of conflict. So I also would just like to welcome your questions as we go along. If I miss something, please make sure that either Miguel or Brendan knows so that they can stop me and we can address that. I'm not very technologically savvy, so it's quite likely I will miss something. So let's begin with just a brief overview of what we're going to be doing. In section 1 this evening, we're going to be talking about the theological and biblical context for transformation, for conflict transformation, and how this is the ground for understanding conflict. What happens with, or what has happened with the gift of free will that we've been given, and then also an admonition, if you will, to reflect on your own attitude and posture toward conflict. This second section is, in a way, defining and normalizing conflict, how we find it amid the people, problems, and process that are key elements in any conflict. It will help us understand how to reframe conflict as an opportunity to grow as Christians and in the vision of God. And we'll also focus in the midst of that on 3 relational aspects through problems, people, and process that have to do with power dynamics, communication dynamics, and the dynamic of anxiety that is often deeply embedded in conflict. The third section will talk about tools that we can use to address conflict. Always we say pray, and we say it all the time, and we say it again. How important it is to ask questions and what kinds of questions, assessing power dynamics, and then once again examining your own attitude, posture, beliefs about conflict. The last is it will be a little bit shorter presentation, mostly to make sure there's plenty of space for you all to ask any questions or have any responses. I'll talk a little bit about what it means to walk through a discovery phase and then discernment of your own role, decide how to go forward, and then whether or not you need to refer this particular situation to an experienced conflict resolution person. Okay, so let's begin with the first section on the theological and biblical context for conflict transformation. So in the very beginning, as we know, when God began to create, God spoke difference into the created order. And in the abundance of God's creativity, we find the raw material of conflict. God's creative acts separated and differentiated one thing from another as God brought forth one aspect of creation and then another, beginning with what was there, dark, formless, void. God spoke and separated the light from the dark, and then further differentiated by naming them day and night. And so it goes until humankind, created in the image and likeness of God, created to be creative in the image and yet in the image of, and yet distinct and different from God. Embedded in creation is also God's longing or desire for relationship with humankind, indeed with all creation, which is seen more readily in Genesis 2 and 3, as God intimately invests God's self in this creative enterprise. This is especially true in God's gift of free will to humankind, a gift of love that necessarily includes the possibility of choosing against, choosing to walk away or differently as free will is exercised. God created this possibility for humankind to make choices different from God's own, and thereby created space or possibility for disagreement or conflict. One could say then, an act of disobedience, the exercise of free will, or a choice different from what God would choose, reveals, and some might even say initiates, the reality of otherness or difference, and reveals the demands of love that come with these first relational and creative acts of God. In the unfolding biblical story, God's faithfulness, or demonstrates, God's faithfulness in relationship to a fickle people who struggle to be faithful, and conflict, the raw material of which was present in the beginning, is part of everyday life. A vivid example of this is seen in Jacob and Esau. Conflict between brothers was embedded in their relationship from the womb, and it explodes into their lives and is the shadow under which they live a significant portion of their lives. We don't know how it is that Esau reached the point of willingness to reconcile with David or Jacob. We're not told that part of the story. But we do know that as Jacob was on his way home, and as fearful as he was, he continued to turn toward the brother he had wronged, and from whom he expected a violent, even warlike response. The story tells us something of the biblical witness about conflict, that in most instances the Lord says, turn, return, go back, take the journey toward your enemy, take the journey toward the one you have wronged or who has wronged you, and I will be with you. Conflict arises out of relationship and is only reconciled within relationship as well. With this as foundation, we come to the Christian story, our story. We know in Jesus the possibility and reality of reconciliation and the transformation of conflict. For at the heart of the cross are the open arms of Christ's self-giving love, embracing us as our Savior created space within himself to receive us, estranged humanity, therein transforming the deepest separation, conflict of the whole of human history. And truly, our experience of reconciliation only happens face to face as we turn and return, as we see and are seen by Jesus, as we receive the forgiving reconciliation we have in Christ's self-giving love. And this is our story, the church's story too. We are called to the ministry of reconciliation. For as Paul lived, and as he tells us in Corinthians and myriad other ways in his letters, in Romans and Galatians and Ephesians, and then as is fully witnessed in the Acts of the Apostles, this is the ministry of the church. Beginning with Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, you remember Jesus' teaching. He speaks of a way of being and a way of life that begins and ends in understanding love and relationship that transcends the cultural norms or expectations and gives witness to this self-giving love that embraces all. He embodies and calls us to a way of being and a way of life that chooses to see the other as created in the image and likeness of God, just as we are, and acts in accordance with this vision. You remember, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, do not resist an evildoer. Turn the other cheek too. Give your cloak as well as your coat. Go that second mile. Do not refuse to give to anyone. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So do not resist, turn, give, go. Do not refuse to give. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Be perfect. And these are not just suggestions, and we do know this. We know Jesus is describing the nature and character of the reign of God here on earth as it already is in heaven. We know we are called and even commanded to participate with God in Christ, to partner with God in Christ through these gospel values that truly do reveal the nature and the character of the reign of God. We are called, even commanded, to be agents of reconciliation, such that the Spirit is free to work and transformation can occur. It has been said that who we are as Christians is defined by how we deal with conflict. It could also be said that who we are as the church is defined by how we deal with conflict and reveals what we truly value. Given Jesus' teaching on how to respond to a brother or sister with whom one has a disagreement, it is apparent that conflict was a part of daily life. And as such, the response to conflict Jesus gives us enacts the gospel values of love and relationship, which Jesus indicates are characteristic of community, even and including the way we treat those who struggle to live these values, those whom we are called to treat as Gentiles and tax collectors, especially if they are unable to respond to the resolution of a disagreement or a conflict. Remembering Jesus' response to those who were outcasts informs our responses, should the conflict or disagreement reach that stage. As Jesus responded with love and the offer of relationship, so I believe we are called to do the same, and in so doing, we reveal who we are as the church by how we respond to conflict among us. So it is biblical to respond to conflict on the grounds of love, love as witnessed in God's self-giving in Christ. For if conflict arises in the midst of relationship, all Christian relationship is defined by this very love as a gospel value, and is love that sees the dignity, the beauty, and possibility in the other. Indeed, a love that sees the image of God in the other. Our attitude about, our posture toward, and perspective on conflict will greatly impact how we respond to the daily reality of conflict, not only in our own lives, but in our church communities. It is truly essential that we reflect on our own notions about conflict. First, and perhaps most importantly, it is important to ask ourselves, do we believe, at least for practical purposes, that conflict is evidence of some kind of sin or moral failing? Do we believe that conflict is bad? Do we believe that conflict is to be avoided at all cost and we are to keep the peace at all cost? Is it truly possible for conflict to be an opportunity for gospel values to be lived, for relationship and love to be embodied, for transformation to happen? It is truly important to reflect on our own beliefs and practices about conflict, and to do so in the light of our faith and the self-giving love that is its ground and its deepest value. So I would invite any responses or questions at this point. And if there aren't any, we'll just keep going. Is there anything emerging, you guys?
We do have a hand raised.
Okay. Well, there, now I can see better. Hello.
So I think you're on mute. There we go.
Oh, I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'm James Thibodeau. My question has to do with, as we're talking about conflict, some books like Antagonists in the Church, and I think When Sheep Attack, talk about different levels of conflict. One is when you have sort of an authentic disagreement over values or something like that, and the other seem to be more, I don't even know how to characterize it, hostility, or it's not just a conflict of minds. There's how do does this fit with what you're talking about? Is there a difference, or do you see those being off base?
Oh, no, I think your question is a good one. I do think that we will get to that in the next sections.
Okay.
And if not, then please ask the question again, and if I've not satisfied you as we go along.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Anybody else?
And please feel free to use the chat box as well. Thank you, James, for that question and for coming on to ask that. If you would rather not verbally do that, you can also use the chat box as well. Again, there's that pop out. You can just find that in the lower part of the screen. You can press that to use that function instead. Great. With that, I think we can go ahead and head on. But again, if you have questions that come into mind, please go ahead and put those in the chat box. We'll be sure to get around to those when we get to our next stopping point.
Okay.
Another option is indeed to raise your hand, just as James did, and then we can bring you on. So both options are possible.
Okay. Great. Thank you. All righty. So let's talk about conflict that happens amid communication with people, problems, and process. These are the three sort of key elements, if you will, of any conflict. But let's just remember that we're grounded in our theological, biblical, and relational context, and that conflict truly can be seen as an opportunity to grow and to engage God's vision and to have a deeper understanding of that as we think about the mission of God in the world. It really is a normal part of ministry, and the more we can grab that and be clear about that within ourselves, the easier, and I hesitate to use the word easier, but there is a certain amount of flexibility that then comes with our capacity for responding to conflict. And it's helpful to remember that what we do in the midst of or in response to conflict is truly gives witness to what we really believe about God and what is possible with God. So it's helpful to remember these three elements when conflict does arise: people, process, and problems. And any of these can actually be the root of a conflict, All of them are probably present. So we'll talk about ways in which you can listen for each and how to decipher, in a way, which is the root of the conflict that you're in or is coming to you. It is in these three that one author wrote that the progression and resolution of conflict actually happens. And as we've seen, all of conflict occurs in relationship. And it's really important to remember that so that it doesn't get objectified, so to speak. And these three, along with the dynamics of anxiety, communication, and power, both real and perceived, are important to attend to, and especially with a non-anxious presence. So let's begin with people. People refers to the who, which makes sense, those directly as well as indirectly involved, those who most visibly express the conflict, those also who are drawn into the conflict. It refers to the relational and psychological elements of a conflict, including people's feelings, emotions, self-esteem, individual perceptions, and conceptualizations of the problem or problems and of the others who are involved. But one considers relationships here as well. So what is the nature of the relationships, real or perceived, that are involved? Who has been hurt? Have relationships been damaged or broken? It's also helpful to note, as you are listening to someone's story, at this stage only to note it, not to do anything about it, however, any strength of relationships that are talked about, for that could be something you could build on down the road. In terms of outcomes down the road, this aspect of conflict, the people, represents a possibility of reaching a kind of closure and interpersonal reconciliation that does have a chance to last in a way that is really helpful. Problems refers to the what. These are the specific issues around which the disagreement or conflict is focused or centered. These usually involve issues of different values, opposing views about how to make a decision, and incompatible needs or interests. There also may be concrete differences regarding use, distribution, or access to scarce resources, such as land or time or money. And often these are referred to as the real root causes of conflict. But it is also here, when you're talking about the what, that people tend to lock into a position over an issue, and that often creates an impasse. It's important to understand the concerns and underlying issues of the conflict and the position that each person brings to the table. So you're trying to uncover what really matters to each person, what is really at stake for each person involved. It is essential at this phase, or this discovery part, to stay focused on the issue or the issues themselves. For conflict often can and will or does escalate if the focus shifts to people as the problem rather than the issues as the problem. When this happens, there is often an accompanying devolution into blame, the need to find and place blame. And then focus is lost, and it's often difficult to recover, because when blame becomes a part of the process, the conflict will often escalate. Sometimes as you listen, however, through the problems, the issues, or what is really at stake, you might even hear some common ground in the needs and the concerns that are expressed, And that, as you hold that, will be something to think about and perhaps build on later when the time is right. Process refers to the how of the conflict, primarily referring to how decisions are made, the way people feel about how they're made, and how problems are addressed. It is often the case that process or a lack of process is the main issue or the main problem. Uncovering process or the ways in which folks have a voice or don't have a voice, are included or not included in decision making, is key to understanding the dynamics of conflict. Process is the most unrecognized cause of conflict and the most ignored element in addressing conflict. We often overlook the process of decision making as a key cause of conflict, but it is here that resentment, feelings of being treated unfairly, and a sense of powerlessness are rooted. People who feel excluded or sense they cannot influence decisions affecting their lives will rarely cooperate with or support decisions that are made. So, good process, especially when moving into reconciliation and conflict transformation, will be marked by openness, empowerment, and participation. Those involved have open access to information and to key moments in decision making. All parties affected are given equal access to participate from equal positions. Learning and discovering the who, what, and how of the conflict in which you find yourself or to which you have been included as a leader in your church community also require your attention to three other key dynamics of conflict. These are the level of anxiety present, the communication dynamics, and the power dynamics present in the conflict, and to some degree in the system in which the conflict has arisen. So as you listen for the ways in which these are at play in the people and the problem and the process or the conflict, how you model and use these, communication, power, and anxiety, are essential in the discovery and the addressing of any conflict. Attending to the anxiety present as one discovers the who, what, and how of the conflict is about listening for and intending to the ways anxiety is being expressed. It is not about fixing the anxiety, rather, it is about paying attention to the level of anxiety present and what people are doing with it. Attending to the anxiety that is there can also help you hear and read between the lines, to ask questions that give you helpful information and to uncover what the conflict is and what it is about. Attending to anxiety is also about listening to one's own anxiety, listening for the directions and places your thoughts and feelings are taking you in response to what you know and are learning about the people and the process and the problems. This also involves listening or attending to your own inner dialogue that occurs as you listen. Taking note of what you're saying to yourself about others or to others, your inner dialogue, as you listen is very helpful, both in managing your own anxiety and in assisting you to respond in ways that are helpful and constructive to the process of discovery and to reconciliation, hopefully transformation of the conflict. This is essential. As a leader, your presence and the character of your presence sets the tone. It's that whole non-anxious presence thing that we hear so much about, and it is really important. So as we listen and attend to the anxiety that is present, we also attend to the ways the dynamics of communication and power have been at work or are present in the conflict. Communication dynamics include the ways and means, both formally and informally, with the individual people involved, have occurred, with both the individual people involved as well as in the community. And especially as these are at play in the conflict right in front of you. This dynamic will be woven throughout the people, problems, and process, but especially process. So it's really important to take note as you listen to each key element. So as you do that, keep in mind these questions. They can be really helpful for you or to you in ascertaining what's going on in the dynamic of communication. So how is information communicated? Who has access to information? Is it hard to get information? Is it public? Is it accurate? How are changes communicated? How does communicating information contribute to decision making? These are really, really helpful to kind of have in the back of your mind as you're listening to folks tell their story. Oh, whoops, I didn't want to put that one up there yet. Hang on a second. As you listen to individual stories and attend to the specific ways communication was attempted by each person involved in the conflict and how information was given or withheld, you'll find these questions arising as you listen. Wait, I think I went too far. Hang on a second. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not great at technology. Okay. So the next, here we go, is attending to the power dynamics or the power differentials that are present in the conflict that you are sitting with. Often where folks will respond to the dynamics of power with anger, passivity, indifference, or at times withdrawal. As leaders, power is often attributed to us that we don't experience, and yet perceived power is just as real to the one who is doing the perceiving. So paying attention to this dynamic involves listening for who has or to whom power is attributed. Power to make decisions, to carry out decisions, who has power over another, or how power is shared. Listen especially for perceived use or misuse of power in the stories that you hear, as this will really give you vital information about the conflict itself, about the people, about the problems, about the process. And it's generally wise not to use power language yourself. When you shift to work, as you shift to working through down the road to reconciliation and transformation, because that kind of language can truly be volatile. So people, process, problems shot through with the dynamics of anxiety, communication, and power are essential to understanding the conflict before you or into which you have been called. So I have this little example. And this is an example that actually did happen. The rector was in her mid or early 40s, I would say. The rector of your church decides, after talking with a small group of millennials about stewardship and being green, that your church should use organic, fair trade coffee and compostable napkins, cups, plates, and utensils during coffee hour and all other fellowship events. The rector bought the new supplies, set a date to begin using them, made an announcement in the bulletin and the weekly email, and charged the hospitality budget. The head of the kitchen committee was visibly upset on the Sunday this began and was found muttering and putting away all of the new and pulling out the old. When asked, the head of the kitchen just clammed up, just mumbled something about the rector making decisions that everyone else just had to live with no matter what they thought. I know it sounds kind of silly, but it is illustrative. Listening to this example, you can readily hear the elements of people, problem, and process, as well as the dynamics of anxiety, communication, and power woven within the elements of the conflict. So the key questions to ask with this example, or any conflict in which you are involved or are asked to enter, is, in terms of people, who is involved directly and indirectly? It would be easy to see that in the example that we had. What are those who are involved thinking and feeling? What are their needs and concerns? What are their perceptions? Problems, what are the issues here? What are the concrete concerns, differences, or even resistances that need to be addressed and hopefully resolved? What are primary and which are tangential? What kind of process is occurring? How are or have been things decided? Who makes the decisions? How are voices included? Who has been excluded? What kind of communication was used in the conflict and who was included or excluded? And power, what are the power dynamics? Who has the power? What are the sources of power? What are the perceptions about power of those involved in the conflict? So using that example as a test case, it's pretty easy to see that in the excitement of the rector, she went off a little without considering any kind of process. She used someone else's budget, even though as a rector she may have had the authority to do that. She certainly did not gather information and spread it out among those people who would be affected. There was no process leading up to its implementation. There wasn't any communication, even though her intention was great and a good thing to do. It created a potentially huge conflict. What the rector did do when she discovered that this had happened is she immediately went to the folks that it most readily impacted and apologized and took a few steps back, and they started over again. But had she not done that, it could have turned into a terrifically divisive issue, and then it would have all been all about the coffee and not about the process. So are there any questions or comments at this point?
And again, people can feel free to enter your questions into the chat box or raise your hand and we'll bring you on screen. I wonder about James' question, and not to put James on the spot, but if you'd be willing to sort of kind of circle back.
And ask it again? Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, let me promote him. There we go. Let's see. All right.
So, yeah, this sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Jump in and start making some decisions. As having been a rector before, I'm now a vicar. The push to make things happen can be felt by rectors from a congregational level. Come on, what are you doing? Let's get things moving.
Sure.
And then the frustrations of having committees, which sometimes don't meet but once a month, and can't seem to make a decision on what kind of paper plates or not paper plates are compostable, or are they going to get, something that's not compostable but is, reusable? Was it made in Indonesia or was it made in the U.S.? All those kinds of things, happening. And so, you can end up trying to push things through, which sounds a lot like this record. So I wonder if, there's even more to the story and the background, and trying to figure out how, in this setup, how leadership and congregation, or leaderships, because there's obviously someone who's in leadership in the kitchen already,
Right.
and leadership from the office, or from the call, or wherever, however you want to call it. How they can get on the same page, and also how the congregation can understand where leadership is coming from, and the congregate and leadership understand, vice versa. I guess the previous question that I had brought up is, what do you do when someone's got it out for you, or and I guess you could put it on either way. If you feel like the rector has a grudge against you or something like that, or if you feel like there's someone in the congregation that's got it out for leadership, regardless of where you are, ordained or not, or on a committee or on staff. What do you do when you've got someone who just seems antagonistic, maybe?
Well, I think one of the real challenges always is, as you're listening to a particular situation, is to listen for the relationships that are involved. And if this particular person is one of those that many of us have in our congregations that seems to find fault all the time with everything, that's important information as you think about going forward. If this is an occasion that two people have, or one person has misunderstood another, or in the case of this rector, she got so excited that she found this group of folks in the congregation that wanted to do something proactive, that was clearly a good thing, and she just thought everyone would understand. So that it was easy for her to take responsibility for that and speak directly to the people that she had upset, and then sort of go back and then build consensus toward this decision. Had it been the case that this had been a long process and the person that was the head of the kitchen was going to find fault no matter what they did, I think the rector would have handled it differently. And there are all kinds of strategies that could have been used at that point. But I used this example because it was so clearly someone wanting to do something for good that she just didn't handle very well. And she learned from that and probably won't make that mistake again. So it was a small thing that created a conflict that, had she not handled through immediate face-to-face action, would have turned into something much worse. But I do think that the question about the folks in our congregations that we all have, will always be there, will always be unhappy, is a different question. And they do create conflict. So the challenge there is often learning how to contain them. And I think that's a different strategy and a different response than really what we're talking about for this particular webinar. Not that I'm trying to avoid the question, but I think the answer would be way too long.
I have one other thought, and then I'll take myself offline, which is I wonder if this is a good opportunity. Sometimes a conflict can be viewed as a failure. If you've been a success, you would have avoided the conflict. On the other hand, a rector working through conflict on something as innocuous as plates and forks and so on with the congregation can be an exercise that maybe of building trust, or seeing how the relationship works in a time of conflict over something that is not life or death. And I mention that simply because my perspective, knee-jerk perspective, is to find conflict as a evidence of failure or fault.
Right.
And so I was looking at this and thinking, this might be a good situation for this congregation and this rector. Do you have anything you would say to that comment?
Well, actually, I do say that very thing at the end of the next section.
Oh,
It's a great segue. No, it's okay. Absolutely, I see conflict, especially at this level, like the example, and there are others we can think of in our own churches, whether we're lay leaders or ordained leaders, that are definitely opportunities to deepen understanding and trust, both relationally and in terms of the mission of the church, a mission of your particular church as well. And I don't see conflict as failure. I see it as normal. And the challenge, I think, for all of us, again, is to really deeply reflect on our own opinion, response to, belief about, theology around conflict. Because as you said, you called it knee-jerk.
Yeah.
That's a gut response to conflict is bad. It's a failure. It's a sin. It means that you're not righteous. I mean, we could go on and on. So I think you just pointed out how important it is to reflect personally on what you think and do some work around that, what you think about conflict.
Thank you for taking my questions.
Certainly. Thank you. Anybody else? Or I think we probably need to get going to get through the next section.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. All right. Here are some practical tools for everyday use. I think most of you probably will know them, but it's good to review them. So keeping in mind as our guiding principle, or better, as our foundation, that conflict is an opportunity to grow and to learn to love, that our response to conflict reveals what we believe about God and the mission of God in the world, we can consider some practical tools to use in conflict. So always we begin with prayer. I know we say it goes without saying, but it's always worth saying again and again. We always begin with prayer. It's important to keep in mind as well the normative nature of conflict. So again, knowing and understanding one's belief about conflict, that it is, whether we know or believe or trust that it is normal, that it happens always in congregations, is actually a really important skill. And the more that we can come to terms with that in our selves, that it is normal, it will help us as we employ some of these other skills. So as we said a minute ago, that it's really important to reflect on what we believe about conflict before a specific conflict arises. That will help us when we respond. And this genuine kind of reflection can lead to a more genuine rather than technical solution and response. So we begin again. What are our basic reflections? What do I believe theologically, biblically, or practically about conflict? What is my first response to conflict? What is my first response to those involved? If it is that conflict is opportunity amid daily life, we have probably already begun to employ one of the most helpful tools available, because then we are not surprised when conflict arises. A lack of surprise when it arises is truly one of the most important tools for diffusing a whole lot of the extra emotion and energy that surrounds conflict. It can minimize defensive responses. It can help create a calmer space to address the conflict at hand. A lack of surprise sends an important message to others about what we think about conflict, and it can help build trust. Trust that you're able to be present and able to respond in a helpful and genuine manner to the conflict at hand. So undergirding this tool, the one that knowing our posture toward conflict so without surprise, is also our capacity to be and remain a non-anxious presence. So by attending to our own anxiety, our own inner dialogue, which we've mentioned before, but this really strengthens and supports our capacity to pay attention, to hear the elements and the dynamics that are present in the conflict and in each other's stories. And a genuine, non-anxious presence is contagious. It helps build trust, and it helps create space for others to tell their stories with less anxiety. So most of us know that communication is an important and practical tool. It's also an essential component of how to respond to conflict. It's necessary to the process, for transformation of conflict cannot happen without it. So I think it's helpful to revisit some of the key components of communication. One of those is listening to our own inner dialogue, the capacity to use it and bracket it. It also impacts our body language, and we know that folks respond to our body language even before we may be knowing we're communicating something, and it often can shut down communication. It's really hard to underestimate the importance of this tool, but it's really, really important. Also, active listening. I'm sure most of us have heard this term. It's an important skill in communication. It's the kind of listening that actively seeks to understand another's perspectives and their viewpoints. It's curious, genuinely so, interested in what the other person has to say. It's used to gather information. So if conflict is like an iceberg and you can generally only see the top, active listening can facilitate surfacing the vast chunk of interests and feelings that are underneath. Active listening is also an exclusive activity. It means that we mentally create space for another and for their story, for their thoughts and their feelings, perspectives, agendas, without judgment. We have to be intentional about creating this space. It's important for facilitating a safe space for folks to tell their stories, for them to know that they're being listened to, respected, and heard. And again, our body language plays a role in active listening as well. You know, you've heard it before. Eye contact, focus on the one speaking, maintaining appropriate eye contact. You know, if your eyes wander, so does your attention. And the person listening certainly knows it and knows it immediately. Active listening is also interactive. The asking of clarifying questions and checking in with the speaker to ensure you are understanding his or her story and perspective. Questions like, I'm curious about what you said. Is this accurate? Or I want to understand what you said. Can you say more about? Or using the feeling words that the other person has used. You are feeling sad and angry about. Is this accurate? And I have noticed, and especially in conflict situations, it is not helpful to preface questions or statements with a tool that many of us learned a long time ago. I hear what you are saying, or I hear you, or I feel you, man, which I would never use, but some of us might. Or, boy, it sounds like. What I've learned is that these, and particularly where anxiety and feelings and emotions are so heightened, that they're not helpful statements or prefaces. What often happens is that folks hear these as patronizing and sense that they are being minimized or dismissed, or even that you are distancing yourself from what the other is saying. And then communication often shuts down rather than deepens. So it is helpful to practice the, I'm curious about what you said. Is that accurate? In non-anxious situations with others or with your spouse even, or your friends, to learn to ask questions that are more open, which are really a helpful tool for getting more information. And paraphrasing is another really important skill. And it's particularly helpful in conflict. It signals that you are hearing and understanding, that you are with them almost in an empathic way, if you will. It's simply using your own words to tell another story so that both you and the other person know you have heard and understood him or her. It's really important, however, to be genuine, because if this is experienced as a technique or some sort of manipulation to get people to say more or to think that you're listening, folks will really often respond defensively. So this is an illustration that I heard when I was doing some of my training. And the instructor described this. The instructor was describing the use of paraphrasing when a woman stood up and said, "I can't stand it when someone repeats what I have just said. It makes me feel like a child." The instructor responded, "You mean when someone parrots what you've just told them, you feel like you aren't being taken seriously?" The woman responded emphatically, "Yes, exactly." The group erupted into laughter as she sat down, convinced that she had been heard and understood because of the instructor's skillful paraphrasing. So, as seen in the example, paraphrasing can also be used as a question. In the example, it deepens the sense of communication as the woman experienced being heard without being judged or minimized. Paraphrasing, using your own words to respond to and repeat another's story, is an important skill and tool, and it too needs practice. And then there is the intentional use of iMessages. How often have we heard this, and yet it is so important? I think, I feel, I believe, I want, I need. Unfortunately, the iMessage communication skill has become so ubiquitous, it's almost lost its effectiveness. But it really is important, and especially in conflict situations. Its basic form is, I feel, you state the feeling, when you state the behavior, because, and you state the effect. I feel upset when you yell at me because it makes it harder for me to talk with you. It sounds so simple, and yet it's really hard to practice when you're in a defended or agitated or anxious place. But being able to do this in communicating with others in the midst of a conflict is really important because it can help model the behavior and it can serve to diffuse intensity of emotion. You are aware that, we all are aware really, that when we take responsibility for our own feelings and actions, it can decrease the defensiveness of another. And so this too is good to practice, especially at home. When conflict arises, it is best to address it as soon as possible. And knowing one's belief about conflict is essential and is a tool. Knowing one's own theology is also essential and a tool. And all of those things that we discussed, cultivating a non-anxious presence, active listening, paraphrasing, iMessages, eye contact, body language, attention to one's inner dialogue are all helpful and important tools in helping us address everyday conflicts that bubble up in congregational life. So I found the following helpful in thinking about my own posture toward and understanding my own place in any conflict, whether I'm a part of the conflict or have been asked to enter it in the hope of bringing reconciliation and transformation. This comes from Richard J. Moe in his book, Christian Civility. He lists traits for living as God's people, a kind of review of gospel values. They're helpful to keep in mind when conflict arises. We're encouraged to be flexible rather than rely on neat formulas. We're to be tentative in living ideological commitments of right and left, and in letting ideological commitments of right and left define us or God. We're admonished to approach God and others with humility, acknowledging that no one can grasp all of God's truth. We are to be filled with awe at God's unending mercy and grace towards us, and we are to be called to find our place in God's larger project with a sense of modesty about how each person fits into the body of Christ. Our understanding of congregational conflict and posture toward the conflict and the folks involved colors and forms our responses. For if it can be said, who we are as church is defined by the way we deal with conflict, then practicing these tools with humility and mercy towards ourselves and others is perhaps the most important tool we have. And of course, prayer. Always we begin with and practice prayer. So I think at this point, given the time, I want to skip this and go quickly to the next section, which is very short. And then if folks want to stay beyond our time, if that's all right with you, and ask any questions, we can have a little wrap up at the end. Is that okay?
Sure. Sounds good.
Okay. So going forward, I just want to do a little synopsis of what we've been talking about. The first, or discovery phase, as I call it, in which you seek to understand and clarify the conflict, the people, the problems, the process, the dynamics of anxiety, communication, and power, give you the information that you need about the conflict itself. So it's once you have a sense of those, what's really, really important is this discernment piece of discerning your role in the conflict. If you're involved in the conflict and you are a leader in the parish, whether ordained or lay, it's really, really important to honestly consider and discern what you can and cannot do in the midst of the conflict. What does it mean if you're the rector? What does it mean if you're the senior warden or the head of a ministry or on staff, as James said earlier? Often, if you are directly involved and the conflict is relatively low level, like the illustration of the coffee and the compostable plates, it can be addressed pretty quickly using the tools explored previously. At this stage, conflict can often be reconciled through gracious and genuine listening, taking responsibility and being accountable for one's actions, real or perceived. And the transformative aspect is in the deepening of relationship and trust, which are clearly gospel values inherent in God's mission in the world. If conflict raises beyond this and you are directly involved, it is wise to consider if this is really in your wheelhouse. Are you able to lead a reconciliation process? This is as much about how you are perceived by the folks involved as it is about your perceived capacity to listen and respond, to be objective, as it is about your actual capacities, in some ways perhaps even more. If you're invited into the conflict as a leader by the people involved, and you are not directly involved, your discernment will be different. Your ability to lead and be present in the midst of a reconciliation process is probably stronger and more flexible and likely to be more beneficial in that situation. So after you've done this discernment, it's important to decide how to go forward using what you've discovered about the conflict and what you've discerned about your role. So unless you have some training in conflict, reconciliation, and transformation, it is truly better to refer most conflicts that are beyond the most basic level to someone outside of the congregation or outside of the system. And generally, we don't do this enough. And so often the conflict worsens, and then often it can unfortunately reach a level that gets to such a critical stage that people leave, things split, and a lot of pain happens. All conflict is complex, multi-layered, with myriad competing interests and embedded deeply within relationships. The more intense the conflict, the more complex and multi-layered it is, the more competing interests there are, and the more profound the relational stakes tend to be. So, the more intense the conflict, the more reason to refer to someone who does have training and experience in conflict reconciliation and transformation. And again, we pray. Okay, so if there are folks who want to hang out for a bit and ask any questions, or are there any comments in the chat boxes or rooms, or if we're done, that's okay too.
Yeah, let's just take the but anyway, so let's just take the next 2 or 3 minutes and see if anyone has questions, and if not, we'll say good evening. So let us know if you want to again type into the chat box or raise your hand. Okay. So a comment, thanks. The reminder that process how is as or more important. What one is a great one. I will carry that with me. From Sylvia.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful.
If anyone does have any additional comments or that, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, thank you, Christy, for preparing all of this wealth of information and material for us this evening. Thank you to everyone who took the time out of their schedules this evening to participate. Quick note before you sign off. In your inbox, if you click over to your email or bring that up on your phone or tablet, at this point will be an email with a link to a survey. Please take a moment to click through on that link. We have a quick survey with some questions to get your feedback about tonight's webinar. We're also using a new platform, and would appreciate any comments that you have about using this, especially if you've been on other ECF webinars. We will, of course, share this feedback with Christy, and we use all of your feedback as well, of course, in planning our future webinars. So thank you again. God bless and Godspeed in your ministry, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you, Chrissy.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, guys. You were great.